Maggie looked deeply into Emily's eyes, the weight of her own past lingering in her gaze. Emily, infidelity is something that can sneak up on you when you least expect it. It often starts with a sense of dissatisfaction or loneliness. You find yourself justifying little things, telling yourself it's harmless, that you deserve a bit of happiness. Emily shifted uncomfortably, but her eyes stayed locked on Maggie's. "Justifications?" she asked quietly. "I am not justifying anything." Maggie gave her a pitying look. "Emily, where does your husband think you are right now?" Emily's eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and defiance. She hesitated before finally admitting, "He thinks I'm at a work conference in Seattle, but I couldn't resist coming here to be with John." Maggie nodded. "Let me guess. He is attentive. The situation is dangerous. He makes you feel alive and wanted. You can't stop thinking about him and what it would be like for him to touch you, love you, make love to you." Emily just stared at her. Maggie wasn't done. "Why not leave your husband, Emily?" Emily's face went pale. "Why would I do that?" Maggie's expression didn't change. "Why would you stay?" Emily didn't have an answer. Maggie continued. "The problem is, Emily, you start to believe that the attention you're getting is something you deserve. That if your husband doesn't give you what you need, then you can and should get it from somewhere else. You start to think that the only thing that matters is how you feel, that your husband will always be there, no matter what." "You make it sound so complicated," Emily said, her voice wavering slightly as she attempted to sound firm. "I know what I want, and I know what makes me happy. My husband does not understand me the way John does. Why shouldn't I explore things with him? Beside, my husband loves me. He loves me enough to allow me this." "Emily, no man with an ounce of self-respect is going to allow his wife to cheat on him because she is bored," said Maggie bluntly. "That is not what I am saying. Emily, I am not trying to hurt your feelings. Quite the contrary. I am trying to help you understand them. Let me ask you this. If your husband found out tomorrow that you were lying about where you are, here meeting with another man who you plan to sleep with, what do you think he would do?" Emily hesitated only briefly. "He would leave me. It would hurt him deeply. Yet you claim that he loves you so much that he would allow you your affair with John." Emily didn't answer. Maggie continued. "You say that you are just exploring things. You seem to draw a line between the emotional and the physical, that you haven't really done anything wrong since you haven't slept with John. Yet emotional affairs can be just as damaging, sometimes more so, because they cut to the very heart of your relationship." Emily looked down at her hands, fidgeting with her napkin. Maggie decided to change the direction slightly. "Emily, why don't you tell me a bit about yourself? Your family, your husband?" Emily hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Well, I'm 35. I've been married to David for 10 years. We have 2 children, Sophie and Jack. Sophie's 8 and Jack is 5. Maggie smiled encouragingly. "They must keep you busy." Emily's face softened at the mention of her children. "They do. They're wonderful kids. Sophie loves to draw, and Jack is into everything related to space. David works in finance. He's very successful, very driven." "Sounds familiar," Maggie said softly. "Tell me about your relationship with David." Emily sighed, the tension returning. "He is a good man, a good father, but he works a lot, is gone a lot, and when he's home, he's often still thinking about work. We barely have time for each other anymore. It's like we're living parallel lives." "How long have you felt this distance?" Emily considered. "Maybe a year. I cannot remember the last time we made love." Maggie nodded, understanding all too well. "So when did John enter the picture?" Emily glanced around the cafe, ensuring John was still on his call. "I met John at a business event a few months ago. He was charming, attentive, everything David used to be. He started asking me to lunch, and I enjoyed the attention. It felt good to be noticed again. Maggie could see the conflict in Emily's eyes. It's easy to be drawn to someone who makes you feel special. Emily sighed, looking down at her hands, then looked up in defiance. This thing with John. It's not a big deal. It's not like I love him. I just want to feel close to someone again. David's so distant, and John makes me feel seen. Maggie nodded, her expression understanding but firm. I understand that need for attention and closeness, Emily. But let me ask you something. What is going on with David? Emily looked at Maggie in confusion. What do you mean? According to you, he has been withdrawn. Unavailable, difficult to engage. Emily nodded. Yes, that is right. So you can probably see why I am. Maggie interrupted her. Emily, have you asked him why? Emily shook her head. Not really. I've tried. It's like he's in his own world. Maggie sighed. Let me tell you more about Dan. Maggie took a deep breath, her eyes reflecting the weight of her memories. It was a warm summer evening when I met Dan Harris at a charity gala. James had to work late, as usual, and I felt a pang of loneliness as I walked into the grand ballroom alone. Dan was the host of the event, and from the moment our eyes met, there was an undeniable spark. He was tall, charismatic, and had a way of making everyone around him feel important. I remember him approaching me with a charming smile. Good evening, he said. I'm Dan Harris. I don't believe we've met before. Maggie Thompson, I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, and his eyes lingered on mine just a moment too long. Throughout the evening, Dan found ways to engage me in conversation. He complimented my dress, asked about my interests, and genuinely seemed interested in what I had to say. It was refreshing and flattering, especially since I had felt so invisible in my own marriage. Our initial flirtations were innocent enough. We exchanged contact information under the pretense of discussing charity work. But as days turned into weeks, our conversations became more personal. Dan would text me throughout the day, little messages that made me smile and feel appreciated. We started meeting for lunches, and those lunches turned into dinners. Maggie paused, looking at Emily to gauge her reaction. Emily was listening intently, her expression a mixture of curiosity and empathy. The attention and validation Dan gave me were intoxicating, Maggie continued. For the first time in years, I felt alive, wanted, and seen. It was like a drug, and I couldn't get enough. Despite the guilt gnawing at me, I justified my actions. I told myself that James was too busy for me, that I deserved this bit of happiness. Maggie's voice softened as she recalled the turmoil she had felt. But the affair fog is real, Emily. It's a state where everything with the other person seems more exciting, more intense. You start to believe that this new person is the answer to all your problems, that they understand you in ways your spouse never could. But it's an illusion, a temporary escape from reality. Dan and I eventually crossed the line into a physical affair. The excitement, the secret meetings, it all felt so thrilling at the time. But with each encounter, the guilt grew stronger. I was living a double life, deceiving the man I had once vowed to love forever. Maggie looked down, her eyes filled with regret. My emotional state during the affair was a roller coaster. The highs were incredibly high, but the lows were devastating. I felt like I was constantly on edge, waiting for the moment everything would come crashing down. And eventually, it did. Maggie took a deep breath, her mind drifting back to the whirlwind of emotions and decisions that led her down a path she never imagined for herself. Emily listened intently, her own turmoil mirrored in Maggie's story. Our secret meetings became more frequent. We met in hidden corners of the city-quaint cafes, tucked away from prying eyes, hotel rooms under aliases, and secluded spots in parks where we could steal a moment together. Each encounter was charged with a mix of passion and guilt that left me reeling. I remember one afternoon in particular. We had arranged to meet at a boutique hotel on the edge of the city. As I walked into the lobby, my heart pounded with anticipation and fear. Dan was waiting for me, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. I started to run to him but stopped as spotted. Jason, my husband's brother. I ducked behind a pillar praying that he didn't see me. I was lucky. He had not. I thought my heart was going to explode. Dan didn't seem to notice. He took my hand and we hurried to our room, eager to escape the world and lose ourselves in each other. In those moments, it was easy to forget everything else. Dan made me feel desired and alive, his touch igniting a fire within me that had long been dormant. But as the euphoria faded, the guilt would creep in, gnawing at the edges of my conscience. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, torn between the life I was living and the one I was risking everything for. James, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the turmoil within me. He was so engrossed in his work, his ambition driving him to spend countless hours at the office. Our conversations became strained, filled with the mundane details of daily life rather than the deep connection we once shared. I grew increasingly distant, both physically and emotionally, as I sank deeper into the affair. I justified my actions with a myriad of rationalizations. I told myself that I deserved happiness, that James would never understand the depth of my loneliness. I convinced myself that I was entitled to the attention and affection Dan lavished upon me. But deep down, I knew these were hollow excuses, a way to assuage the guilt that threatened to consume me. The affair fog, as they call it, clouded my judgment. It made everything with Dan seem more exciting, more vivid. The stolen kisses, the whispered secrets, the thrill of being wanted. It was all so intoxicating. I began to believe that Dan was the answer to my unhappiness, that he understood me in ways James never could. But with each secret meeting, the weight of the deception grew heavier. I started to dread the moments when I would have to return home, to face James and the life I was betraying. I became an expert at hiding my emotions, at pretending everything was fine. But the cracks were starting to show, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Emily listened, her expression a mix of empathy and fear. Maggie's story was a stark reminder of the dangers of infidelity, of how easily one could get caught up in a web of lies and deceit. "So you kept going back to him, even though you knew it was wrong?" Emily asked softly. Maggie nodded, a look of deep regret in her eyes. "Yes, Emily. The affair was like a drug, and I was addicted. Each time I met Dan, I felt a rush of adrenaline, a fleeting sense of happiness that I craved. But it was never enough. The guilt and the fear of being caught were always there, lurking in the background." Emily sighed, her own feelings of guilt surfacing. "I understand that feeling, the excitement, the thrill of being noticed. It's hard to resist." "Yes, it was," Maggie agreed. "I did not resist, and this went on for almost 2 years.